Miami Junction, the groups from the state convenience government came here to take a mountain. But in 1934, the United States government came here to take a mountain. Lem Ownby had a deed from 1847, 5 generations deep. Washington said it didn't count. 11 federal agents walked up this trail that year.
Lem's formal complaint filed with ATF on March 15th had described deed-taking as theft serving no enforcement purpose, had explained that document was irreplaceable proof of ownership spanning 173 years, had requested immediate return, and that Webb be investigated for corruption. ATF Supervisor David Mitchell had dismissed complaint explaining that document verification was legitimate investigative procedure, and that deed would be returned when analysis confirmed authenticity, response that ignored Lem's protests that paper's obvious legitimacy made verification unnecessary, and that retention created vulnerability that land acquisition schemes could exploit. Discovery that deed theft was part of development conspiracy occurred when Lem had visited County Clerk's office, attempting to obtain certified copies of deed recordings, visit during which Clark had mentioned that Nashville developer had recently inquired about Ownby property, asking whether ownership documentation was complete, question that had immediately suggested coordination between Webb's theft and developer's interest. Further investigation revealed that same developer, Thomas Harrison of Nashville Development Corporation, had acquired multiple mountain properties during previous 2 years through challenging elderly owners' titles and through purchasing disputed lands when verification processes had created uncertainties about ownership, that sellers had accepted settlement offers rather than engaging in expensive litigation to defend. Lem Ownby's decision to systematically eliminate 11 men involved in deed theft was individual determination made during solitary deliberation on March 15th of evening. Same day, Mitchell had dismissed complaint. Decision represented personal response rather than family or community action, creating situation where systematic campaign would be executed by single mountain man working alone, using knowledge that lifetime of hunting and woodsmanship had taught about tracking prey through difficult terrain and about employing rifle marksmanship. That isolation had developed through decades of subsistence hunting, requiring precise shooting for obtaining food. Planning involved identifying who'd participated in theft or in development conspiracy, determining where targets could be isolated in mountain terrain, allowing rifle attacks from concealed positions, preparing equipment that solitary hunting had made second nature, including Winchester Model 70 rifle in .30-06 caliber that Lem had owned for 30 years and whose ballistics and whose accuracy he knew intimately through countless hours of practice. Method of rifle shooting from concealment had been chosen because Lem possessed exceptional marksmanship developed through lifetime of hunting, where single shots needed to kill cleanly to avoid losing wounded game in dense forest. Because mountain terrain provided countless positions where skilled woodsmen could observe targets while remaining invisible to victims who lacked wilderness expertise. Because solitary attacks would send message that mountain man defending ancestral property was formidable adversary that development conspirators had underestimated when assuming that elderly hermit could be victimized without consequences. Planning involved reconnaissance determining officers' routines and movements, establishing shooting positions, offering clear fields of fire while providing concealment and escape routes, preparing to conduct campaign across weeks, allowing time between killings for repositioning and for avoiding patterns that investigation might anticipate. The systematic elimination began March 15th, when Agent Marcus Webb, who'd stolen deed, was found dead along Mountain Road near his vehicle, killed by single rifle shot fired from approximately 300 yards distance that had struck Webb in chest, causing immediate death. Killing demonstrated that primary perpetrator of theft had been targeted, first establishing pattern that subsequent deaths would confirm. Webb's death created immediate concern throughout law enforcement community, where precision rifle shooting from distance was unusual murder method, raising questions about whether killing represented professional assassination or represented mountain hunting skills employed for vengeance. Realization that would become clear as additional deaths occurred following same pattern. Deputy Robert Mitchell, who'd been among agents participating in raid, died March 18th from similar precision shooting while walking to vehicle after work. Bullet fired from wooded hillside approximately 400 yards distant, demonstrating that perpetrator possessed exceptional marksmanship and possessed knowledge of terrain, allowing attacks from positions that investigation struggled to locate. Pattern continued throughout March and April, with agents dying through long-range rifle shots that ballistics analysis determined came from same Winchester rifle, killings occurring in locations throughout eastern Tennessee, suggesting that perpetrator was mobile and was familiar with regional geography, allowing him to position for attacks and to disappear into wilderness before responses could be organized. Most disturbing aspect of campaign was targeting of Nashville developers involved in conspiracy, 4 businessmen associated with Harrison's Development Corporation dying during April through precision rifle shots that demonstrated perpetrator was expanding beyond law enforcement targets to include civilians whose participation in land acquisition scheme had made them complicit in deed theft. Deaths of developers created panic throughout Nashville business community when it became clear that Mountain Man was systematically eliminating everyone connected to conspiracy, regardless of whether targets were federal agents or were private citizens. That whoever was conducting campaign possessed both skills and determination, making him extremely dangerous adversary that conventional law enforcement responses seemed incapable of stopping. By May 28th, 11 men were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded despite massive investigation involving FBI, ATF, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and local law enforcement, deploying hundreds of officers attempting to identify perpetrator and to prevent additional killings. Investigation had focused immediately on Lem Ownby, given obvious motive following deed theft, but establishing direct evidence linking him to killings proved impossible when attacks had been conducted from remote positions without witnesses, and when Lem maintained he'd been at cabin during times when murders occurred, alibis that isolation made difficult to verify, but that lack of physical evidence made impossible to disprove. Breakthrough came not through investigation, but through voluntary contact when Lem had appeared at FBI office in Knoxville on May 29th, carrying Winchester rifle and written confession detailing 11 killings, surrender that had been motivated by Lem's satisfaction that everyone responsible for deed theft had been eliminated, and by his recognition that continuing to evade capture would require leaving property that defending land ownership had been entire purpose of campaign. Written confession had explained that systematic killings had been necessary for protecting ancestral property from development conspiracy that deed theft had facilitated. That Mountain Code held that thieves who stole land documentation deserved death when legal systems refused prosecuting corrupt agents who collaborated with developers exploiting elderly landowners. Most remarkable aspect of confession was detailed ballistics information Lem had provided, written account describing each killing including range, wind conditions, bullet placement, demonstrating that attacks had been conducted with professional precision that lifetime of hunting had developed. Confession had also included recovered land grant deed that Lem had obtained from Webb's residence during reconnaissance before killing him, original 1796 document that theft had motivated entire campaign and whose recovery had been essential for ensuring that property remained secure regardless of what legal consequences Lem would face for murders. Trial for 11 murders occurred in October 1969 at Federal Courthouse in Knoxville, where Lem Ownby faced prosecution for killing federal agents and civilians, case that attracted national media attention, both because precision rifle shooting demonstrated mountain hunting skills and because defense's emphasis on protecting ancestral property from development conspiracy raised questions about whether deed theft had provoked violence that might otherwise not have occurred. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence including Lem's detailed confession, ballistics analysis proving Winchester rifle had fired bullets killing all victims, systematic pattern demonstrating premeditation rather than spontaneous violence. Defense didn't dispute that Lem had participated in planning and executing systematic shooting campaign, but argued that actions had been desperate response to theft of irreplaceable property documentation that development conspiracy had stolen to facilitate land acquisition targeting elderly mountain landowner, whose ancestral property developers had viewed as valuable real estate that corrupt. federal agents could help obtain through stealing deeds. Defense presented evidence documenting Webb's involvement in development scheme, presented testimony from other Mountain families describing similar attempts to challenge their titles, emphasized that legal system had refused prosecuting deed theft, leaving Lem without remedies for recovering document essential for defending ownership. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony of property law experts and Appalachian culture historians, who explained that in mountain communities where families had maintained continuous occupation across multiple generations, land ownership represented identity and represented independence, that external threats attacking property rights were experienced as existential violations rather than as simple business disputes. Experts testified that 1796 land grant deed represented irreplaceable documentation that Tennessee's complicated property law history made essential for defending against title challenges. That theft of such document was experienced as attack on family heritage spanning 173 years, rather than as ordinary property crime that monetary compensation could address. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of deed theft's significance and regardless of development conspiracy's corruption, systematic assassination of 11 people through precision rifle shooting constituted murder that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming property protection or through arguing that legal remedies were inadequate. Prosecutors noted that victims had included 4 civilians who, as business developers, hadn't been law enforcement officers and whose involvement in conspiracy, while potentially criminal, didn't warrant execution without trial. That killing 11 people for one stolen document represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that deed was irreplaceable and that theft had been calculated crime. Jury deliberated 21 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 11 murder counts. Longest jury deliberation in Tennessee. Federal court history reflected unprecedented complexity evaluating solitary mountain man whose exceptional skills had enabled systematic campaign motivated by defending ancestral property from development conspiracy that corrupt federal agents had facilitated. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply sympathetic to Lem's loss and had been disturbed by evidence that Webb had been corrupt agent collaborating with developers, but that precision nature of shootings and inclusion of civilian targets had made convictions necessary when overwhelming evidence proved deliberate murders rather than defensive violence that deed theft might have partially excused. Judge sentenced Lem to life imprisonment without parole on multiple counts to be served consecutively, effective life sentence, acknowledging severity of killing 11 people, while noting that property theft and development conspiracy created mitigation that death penalty consideration had rejected. Sentencing created controversies when property rights advocates argued punishment was excessive, given corruption that had provoked violence, while law enforcement organizations maintained that systematic murder of agents deserved unqualified condemnation, regardless of whether victims had been corrupt. Lem Ownby died in federal prison in 1994 at age 93 from natural causes, having served 25 years, had maintained throughout imprisonment that deed theft had justified eliminating everyone involved in conspiracy. That mountain code held that protecting ancestral land from thieves was righteous obligation that prison couldn't make him regret. Lem had refused multiple requests for interviews, had lived final quarter-century in isolation, similar to mountain existence, that defending property had required abandoning silent prisoner whose reputation as skilled marksman and whose solitary nature had made him respected figure among inmates who viewed him as mountain man, who defended heritage against governmental corruption. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought renewed attention to Ownby case, when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained Development Corporation files and ATF internal documents. Research revealed that Nashville Development Corporation had acquired 17 mountain properties during 1967-1971 period through systematic scheme where corrupt federal agents would steal deeds during raids and developers would challenge titles during verification delays. Conspiracy that had netted developers' properties worth approximately $2. $3 million that fraudulent acquisitions had obtained for fraction of market values. Morrison published findings in 2016, book titled Mountain Wraith: How Stolen Land Deed-Created Precision Vengeance, comprehensive examination documenting mountain property ownership traditions, 1796 deed significance, development conspiracy, systematic rifle campaign, trial and imprisonment. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that ATF supervisors had known about Webb's involvement in development schemes, but had tolerated corruption because successful agents who conducted numerous raids were valued, regardless of whether criminal activities accompanied enforcement operations. That internal communications had characterized mountain landowners as backwards populations whose property claims were obstacles to economic development that region needed. Correspondence revealed that some ATF officials had actually encouraged agents to identify valuable properties during raids, creating culture where theft of documentation was viewed as acceptable behavior when facilitating development that political interests supported. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2021, film titled When Deeds Disappeared, Lem Ownby's Rifle Justice, featuring interviews with property law experts, Appalachian culture historians, Morrison discussing research findings, descendants of Ownby family, expressing perspectives about whether systematic shooting had been justified response to deed theft. Documentary presented balanced account acknowledging both irreplaceable significance that 1796 land grant represented and 11 deaths affecting families regardless of deceased individuals' degrees of culpability for theft or for development conspiracy. Most powerful documentary segment featured interview with surviving Ownby family member Martha Ownby, age 72 in 2021. Lem's great-niece who'd inherited property following his death. Martha explained that Lem understood that losing 1796 deed meant losing ability to defend property against challenges that developers were filing systematically against mountain families. That without original grant showing unbroken chain of title spanning 173 years, we'd have been vulnerable to claims that ownership wasn't properly documented. Having Webb steal deed as part of conspiracy with Nashville developers meant they were planning to take land that 5 generations of Ownbys had defended. Lem believed that protecting ancestral property justified whatever violence was necessary when legal systems protected corrupt agents rather than prosecuting theft. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from interviews with families of some 11 killed individuals. Interviews revealed complex perspectives, ranging from those who maintained relatives had been murder victims, whose deaths deserved unqualified condemnation, to those who acknowledged deceased family members had participated in conspiracy that was systematically defrauding mountain families of ancestral properties. Several families described how learning details about development scheme and about Webb's systematic corruption had changed understanding of case, explained that initial characterization of relatives as victims of unprovoked violence had evolved into recognition that institutional failures had enabled conspiracy, affecting numerous families whose properties had been targeted. Federal government conducted review in 2020, examining law enforcement involvement in property acquisition schemes. Review identified patterns where corrupt agents had been stealing documentation during raids to facilitate development conspiracies. That oversight had been inadequate for detecting such corruption when supervisors had prioritized enforcement statistics over investigating complaints about missing deeds or surveys. Review concluded that reforms were necessary for preventing incidents where property theft created grievances that evidence suggested could motivate violence when families lost ancestral lands to conspiracies that legal systems refused prosecuting. Federal legislation passed in 2022 established Lem Ownby Ancestral Property Protection during Law Enforcement Operations Act, requiring federal agencies to implement strict protocols for handling property documentation discovered during raids, requiring that original deeds never be removed from premises without owners' written consent and without issuing receipts with detailed descriptions, establishing criminal penalties for agents who steal or mishandle such documents, creating independent oversight for investigating complaints about missing property records. Legislation was named for Lem, recognizing that his case had exposed institutional failures requiring reforms. that preventing similar tragedies required federal standards, ensuring that ancestral property documentation would be protected during enforcement operations. Historical marker installed at Ownby property in 2023 reflected balanced approach. Lem Ownby, 1969, systematically killed 11 people, including federal agents and developers, following theft of 1796 land grant deed during ATF raid. Agent Marcus Webb stole original deed as part of conspiracy with Nashville Development Corporation targeting mountain properties. Deed represented irreplaceable documentation proving ownership spanning 173 years. Ownby conducted precision rifle campaign from mountain positions, demonstrating exceptional marksmanship. Convicted after 21-day jury deliberation. Served 25 years until death. Case prompted federal reforms including Lem Ownby Ancestral Property Protection Act. This site reminds us that property documentation deserves protection, that ancestral lands represent heritage, that corruption creates grievances. By 2024, Ownby case remained most studied example, examining intersection of property rights and law enforcement corruption, case studied in training about protecting documentation during operations, and about understanding that seemingly mundane papers like deeds can have profound significance in communities where families have maintained continuous occupation across multiple generations. Modern property rights and Appalachian culture movements invoke Lem Ownby as symbol of resistance to development conspiracies that corrupt federal agents facilitated, argue that systematic shooting, while legally unjustifiable, represented desperate assertion that ancestral property couldn't be stolen through corruption, that legal systems refused prosecuting. Comparative analysis examining Ownby's 11 victims revealed complex picture where Agent Webb had stolen deed and had been primary organizer of conspiracy, making him undisputed focus of campaign. 3 other ATF agents had participated in raid and had knowledge of conspiracy creating complicity that rifle attacks had treated as warranting death. 4 Nashville developers had been actively involved in acquisition scheme purchasing fraudulently obtained properties. 3 remaining victims had been attorneys and surveyors working for Development Corporation whose professional services had facilitated title challenges that conspiracy depended on pursuing. This distribution raised questions about whether killing professionals who'd merely provided services represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that Webb's theft and developers' conspiracy had been violations deserving accountability. Modern scholarship examining Ownby case within broader context of Appalachian property rights has revealed that deed theft represented pattern during 1960s-1970s, when rapid development of mountain regions had created pressures on ancestral landowners whose properties developers viewed as valuable real estate that acquisition schemes could obtain, that numerous families had experienced similar attempts to challenge titles or to purchase lands through pressure tactics that elderly owners sometimes accepted rather than fighting expensive legal battles. Comprehensive analyses examining this period have documented hundreds of incidents where mountain properties had changed hands through questionable means. Patterns suggesting that Ownby violence, while exceptional in its systematic precision, represented in terms of underlying grievance about property theft that affected entire region whose traditional land tenure systems modern development was threatening. What distinguished Ownby case from other property disputes was combination of 1796 deed, representing exceptionally old and irreplaceable documentation rather than modern title records that could be reconstructed. Solitary individual conducting campaign rather than family group coordinating. Precision rifle shooting, demonstrating exceptional marksmanship developed through lifetime of hunting. Systematic targeting based on participation in conspiracy rather than random violence. Voluntary surrender after completing elimination of all targets. Trial raising unprecedented questions about whether protecting ancestral property could ever partially excuse multiple murders. By 2024, the recovered 1796 land grant deed displayed at Tennessee State Museum had become powerful educational tool, actual document that Lem had stolen back from Webb, showing territorial governor's signature, and official seals proving Ownby family's ownership spanning 173 years. Physical evidence that allowed museum visitors to understand that deed theft had represented attack on irreplaceable heritage rather than on simple property that replacement documentation could protect. Educational placards explained land grant significance in Tennessee property law, described how original deeds from territorial period were essential for proving unbroken chains of title, explained how development conspiracies had targeted elderly mountain landowners whose valuable properties, modern title insurance, and legal resources hadn't adequately protected. Museum exhibit included topographical maps showing Ownby property's location and showing positions from which Lem had conducted rifle attacks, markings indicating shooting distances ranging from 300 to 600 yards, demonstrating exceptional marksmanship that precision shooting at such ranges required. Expert analysis explained that ballistics calculations for engaging targets at extended ranges required understanding of bullet drop, wind deflection, and other factors that skilled hunters internalized through practice. That Lem's consistent success hitting targets at distances exceeding what most shooters could achieve demonstrated lifetime of experience that mountain subsistence living had developed. Museum's complimentary exhibit honored 11 killed individuals, displayed photographs and biographical information about each victim, included statements from families describing losses and describing perspectives about whether relatives' deaths had been preventable if property documentation protections had been prioritized, or whether deaths represented inevitable consequences when development conspiracies systematically targeted ancestral landowners whose properties corrupt agents helped obtain. Balanced presentation that refused simplifying story into narrative celebrating Ownby resistance or condemning rifle violence, acknowledged complexity requiring visitors to grapple with competing values about property rights, about preventing corruption, about limits of justifiable violence defending heritage. Contemporary debates about Ownby case reflected broader conflicts about limits of property rights when defending ancestral lands, about whether corruption justifies vigilante violence, about how societies should balance sympathy for landowners protecting heritage against condemnation of systematic murder. Modern property rights movements invoke Ownby when advocating for stronger protections against development conspiracies, while legal reform advocates emphasize that 11 deaths demonstrate why corruption must be prosecuted rather than creating conditions where desperate responses become likely. Until next time, remember that Lem Ownby systematically killed 11 people after Agent Marcus Webb stole 1796 land grant deed during ATF raid as part of conspiracy with Nashville developers targeting mountain properties. That deed represented irreplaceable documentation proving ownership spanning 173 years, that theft had made vulnerable to title challenges, that Lem conducted precision rifle campaign demonstrating exceptional marksmanship developed through lifetime of hunting, that 21-day jury deliberation examined whether protecting ancestral property could partially excuse murders before convicting on all counts. That case prompted federal reforms establishing Lem Ownby Ancestral Property Protection Act, requiring strict protocols for handling documentation, and that ultimately property records deserve protection during operations, that ancestral lands represent heritage, that development conspiracies systematically threatened, that corruption stealing irreplaceable deeds creates grievances that mountain men defending family properties across generations will respond to through violence when legal systems refuse prosecuting theft disguised as evidence collection. Reconciliation efforts initiated in 2024 brought together descendants of killed individuals and Ownby family members in dialogue, examining how property theft and systematic violence had affected multiple generations. Conversations that acknowledge complexity that simple narratives couldn't capture, about whether protecting ancestral lands justified 11 deaths or whether legal remedies should have been pursued despite corruption. Participants emphasized that understanding required recognizing both legitimate grievances about irreplaceable deed theft and devastating losses affecting families whose relatives had been killed through precision rifle attacks that demonstrated mountain man's exceptional skills employed for vengeance that development conspiracy had provoked. Modern legal scholarship examining property rights during law enforcement operations has used Ownby case as primary example when analyzing tensions between protecting documentation and conducting legitimate investigations. Scholars debate whether strict protocols preventing removal of original deeds create obstacles for prosecuting crimes when evidence might require seizing documents, or whether such protections are essential for preventing theft that corruption enables when oversight is inadequate. Contemporary property law training incorporating Ownby case emphasizes that respecting documentation serves practical function preventing violence, that understanding ancestral lands have significance exceeding market value is necessary for conducting operations without creating grievances through stealing irreplaceable records, proving ownership across generations. Training materials cite specific example of web stealing deed, resulting in 11 deaths as demonstration, that property theft creates cascading harms affecting communities when families defending heritage employ desperate measures that legal systems condemn, but that Mountain Code justified as protecting lands that ancestors had established and that descendants were obligated to maintain. International property rights organizations examining documentation protection frequently cite Ownby case as example demonstrating consequences when corrupt agents exploit enforcement authority for facilitating development schemes. Scholars note that ancestral land tenure globally creates significance, that modern legal frameworks may inadequately recognize when documentation represents connections to heritage that monetary compensation cannot replace. Research examining property conflicts across multiple nations has revealed patterns where documentation theft has motivated violence. That Ownby rifle campaign represented broader phenomenon, where populations defending ancestral territories from exploitation employ whatever skills traditional living has taught when institutional failures enable systematic theft that official channels refuse addressing. The enduring questions that Ownby case raises about appropriate protections for property documentation during operations, about whether ancestral land theft justifies systematic murder, about how development pressures should be balanced against traditional tenure systems, about whether solitary individual defending heritage deserves different moral assessment than coordinated group violence. These remain unresolved 55 years after rifle campaign, continue shaping debates about property rights protections, about preventing corruption, about limits of justifiable violence defending lands. Annual memorial gatherings demonstrate that time alone doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility when institutions enable theft and when mountain men respond through systematic violence. That honest examination requires acknowledging both legitimate grievances about irreplaceable documentation and 11 deaths affecting families regardless of victims' degrees of participation in conspiracy. By 2024, surviving Ownby family members, including Martha, who inherited property, had maintained continuous occupation demonstrating that Lem's violence had succeeded in protecting ancestral land from development conspiracy. 300-acre property remaining undeveloped mountain terrain that 5 generations plus Martha's stewardship had preserved, despite pressures that surrounding areas had experienced. Martha's continued presence on land that 1796 deed had documented and that Lem's rifle campaign had defended created living testament to mountain families' determination to maintain ancestral properties regardless of legal or economic forces attempting to acquire valuable real estate. That traditional occupation had claimed across centuries, predating modern property law frameworks that documentation requirements had created. What Ownby violence demonstrated most fundamentally was that when corrupt federal agents employ legitimate enforcement operations as cover for stealing irreplaceable property documentation, enabling development conspiracies targeting ancestral lands that families have maintained across generations, spanning nearly 2 centuries, when institutional systems tolerate such theft through protecting corrupt agents, whose enforcement statistics supervisors valued more than investigating complaints about missing deeds, when legal remedies prove inadequate for prosecuting corruption or for recovering stolen documents before title challenges can be filed, exploiting verification delays, then solitary mountain men possessing exceptional marksmanship developed through lifetimes of subsistence hunting will deliver systematic retribution, employing precision rifle shooting from concealed positions that wilderness expertise enables, will methodically eliminate everyone involved in conspiracy, regardless of whether targets are federal agents or civilian developers or professional services providers, will voluntarily surrender only after completing campaign ensuring all perpetrators have been punished, and after recovering stolen documentation that protecting required violence that legal systems condemned, but that Mountain Code justified as righteous defense of heritage that ancestors had established through original grants, and that descendants were morally obligated to maintain even when protecting property required employing skills that isolation had developed and required accepting imprisonment, that defending lands made necessary sacrifice, demonstrating that ancestral territory represented values exceeding personal freedom when alternative was losing properties to theft disguised as law enforcement, that corruption had transformed from legitimate authority into criminal enterprise facilitating development schemes systematically targeting elderly mountain landowners whose valuable real estate modern economics coveted, but whose traditional tenure, systems, legal frameworks inadequately protected against conspiracies that federal agents' participation made particularly threatening, when governmental authority lent legitimacy to criminal activities that institutional oversight had failed, preventing through tolerating corruption rather than prosecuting agents who stole irreplaceable documentation, proving ownership that Tennessee's complicated property law history made essential for defending against title challenges that developers pursuing fraudulent acquisitions would inevitably file during verification delays that deed theft had created, making vulnerable families whose ancestral claims original grants established, but whose documentation absence left defenseless against modern legal attacks that conspiracy had carefully planned would succeed unless violence intervened, protecting heritage through eliminating everyone whose participation in scheme had made them legitimate targets, that mountain justice decreed deserved death when official channels refused delivering accountability, that institutional failures had made individually administered retribution necessary for defending what 5 generations had maintained and what 6th generation continued occupying because Lem's rifle campaign had succeeded, protecting property. That systematic precision shooting from mountain positions had defended against development conspiracy that corrupt federal agents had facilitated, but that exceptional marksmanship and wilderness expertise and solitary determination had defeated through violence that 21-day jury deliberation examined before determining that protection of ancestral lands, while understandable motivation couldn't excuse systematic murder, that 11 deaths represented, regardless of how irreplaceable documentation theft had been or how corrupt conspiracy targeting property had been, when legal alternatives existed, even if inadequate for timely recovery of stolen deeds or for prosecuting agents whose supervisors protected, rather than investigating when complaints documented theft-serving development schemes rather than legitimate law enforcement purposes, that raid authorization had ostensibly justified, but that ulterior criminal motives had actually driven creating situation where governmental authority had been weaponized against mountain family whose only recourse became employing skills that traditional living had taught for defending heritage, that modern legal systems inadequately protected, but that Mountain Code held sacred, requiring whatever violence was necessary for maintaining continuous occupation that ancestors had established, and that descendants were honor-bound to preserve across generations, regardless of legal consequences, that defending property might require accepting as necessary sacrifice when alternative was losing lands to theft that institutions tolerated, rather than prosecuting creating conditions where desperate individual responses became inevitable when families understood that official channels wouldn't provide justice, requiring taking matters into own hands through systematic elimination of everyone whose participation in conspiracy had made them complicit in attempted theft of ancestral territory, that 173 years of family occupation had established rights to maintain that modern development pressures and corrupt federal agents and Nashville developers' greed couldn't legitimately challenge, but that documentation theft had been designed to facilitate through creating vulnerabilities during verification delays when original deeds' absence would leave property defenseless against title disputes that fraudulent claims would pursue, knowing that elderly mountain landowner lacked resources for expensive litigation, that defending ownership through legal channels would require making settlement offers appear reasonable alternatives to costly court battles that conspiracy had calculated would succeed unless violence intervened, protecting heritage through methods that wilderness living had taught, and that lifetime of hunting had perfected, enabling precision rifle shooting that 11 systematic eliminations had demonstrated, making Lem Ownby into legend, representing mountain resistance to development conspiracies and representing individual determination defending ancestral lands through employing whatever skills and whatever violence property protection required when legal systems failed providing remedies that corruption and institutional tolerance of theft had made necessary for families whose heritage and whose independence and whose identity depended on maintaining properties that generations had occupied and that modern pressures threatened to acquire through schemes that federal agents' participation made particularly dangerous when governmental authority facilitated rather than prevented criminal conspiracies, targeting vulnerable populations whose traditional tenure systems' legal frameworks inadequately recognized deserving protections that documentation requirements theoretically provided, but that theft during raids undermined, leaving families defenseless, except through employing desperate measures that Mountain Code justified as righteous defense, even when legal systems condemned systematic murder, that protecting property had required accepting as necessary consequence of defending what ancestors had established and what descendants were morally obligated maintaining across generations, regardless of imprisonment or death that violence might bring, when alternative was losing everything to corruption that institutions tolerated rather than prosecuting. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of property rights and systematic violence across 55 years, the discovery that Nashville Development Corporation had systematically acquired 17 mountain properties through conspiracy where corrupt ATF agents stole deeds during raids, enabling developers to challenge titles during verification delays, netting $3 million in fraudulently obtained lands, and the theft of 1796 land grant deed that Lem Ownby's great-great-grandfather had received from territorial governor, representing irreplaceable documentation, proving ownership, spanning 173 years that theft had made vulnerable to title challenges that development scheme required filing, the ATF's dismissal of complaint protecting agent Marcus Webb, whose corruption supervisors tolerated, because successful enforcement statistics were valued more than investigating theft that facilitated development conspiracies targeting elderly mountain landowners, the systematic precision rifle campaign where Lem conducted attacks from mountain positions 300 to 600 yards distant, demonstrating exceptional marksmanship developed through lifetime of subsistence hunting, requiring single clean shots for obtaining food. The 11 deaths, including federal agents and Nashville developers and professional services providers, whose participation in conspiracy had made them targets that solitary mountain man methodically eliminated across 11 weeks before voluntarily surrendering after recovering stolen deed. The 21-day jury deliberation, examining whether protecting ancestral property could partially excuse murders before convicting on all counts, making longest deliberation in Tennessee federal history. The life imprisonment where Lem served 25 years until death, maintaining that Mountain Code justified violence defending heritage that ancestors had established. The federal legislation establishing Lem Ownby Ancestral Property Protection Act, requiring strict protocols, preventing removal of original deeds without written consent, and establishing criminal penalties for theft, creating reforms named after Mountain Man, whose rifle campaign had exposed institutional failures. The recovered 1796 deed displayed at museum, showing territorial governor's signature, and official seals proving ownership that theft had threatened. The reconciliation efforts uniting descendants 55 years later, while Martha Ownby maintained continuous occupation on 300-acre property, demonstrating that violence had succeeded protecting ancestral land from development conspiracy. The impossible questions about whether solitary individual defending heritage deserves different moral assessment than coordinated group violence, and whether stealing irreplaceable documentation proving ownership across generations justified systematic murder, eliminating everyone involved in conspiracy regardless of degrees of culpability. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how property documentation theft creates desperate responses, how ancestral lands in mountain culture represent identity and independence that modern development pressures systematically threatened, how precision rifle skills developed through subsistence hunting become deadly weapons when employed for vengeance that corruption provoked. Comment about whether systematic shooting was proportional response to deed theft, or whether legal remedies should have been pursued despite inadequacy for timely recovery and for prosecuting corrupt agents, whether 55 years provides adequate perspective for reconciliation when Lem died in prison defending property that Martha continues occupying, whether memorial should emphasize corruption enabling conspiracy or acknowledge 11 deaths affecting families, regardless of victims' participation in scheme. Because these questions persist wherever ancestral property rights conflict with modern development, wherever corrupt agents facilitate schemes exploiting vulnerable populations, wherever documentation theft threatens traditional tenure systems, wherever legal remedies prove inadequate for addressing grievances, requiring individuals employ desperate measures, defending heritage that generations have maintained and that descendants are morally obligated, protecting even when violence becomes necessary, for preserving what ancestors established, across centuries of continuous occupation that modern property law frameworks inadequately. Recognize deserving protections against conspiracies that federal agents' corruption enables threatening to dispossess families whose traditional claims, original grants documented, but whose documentation theft during raids made vulnerable to challenges that development schemes carefully planned would succeed, unless systematic elimination of perpetrators intervened defending ancestral lands through employing whatever skills wilderness living taught, and whatever violence mountain code justified as righteous protection of heritage that legal systems condemned but that cultural values held sacred, requiring accepting imprisonment or death as necessary sacrifices when alternatives meant losing everything to theft that institutions tolerated rather than prosecuting creating conditions where solitary responses became inevitable, when mountain men understood official channels wouldn't provide justice, that defending property required taking into own hands through precision rifle shooting, that exceptional marksmanship enabled eliminating targets from concealed positions, that terrain knowledge provided, making systematic campaign possible, that voluntary surrender after completion demonstrated had been motivated by protection rather than by random violence when recovering stolen deed, and eliminating all conspirators had achieved objectives that defending ancestral territory required accomplishing regardless of legal consequences, that protecting property made accepting necessary when maintaining continuous occupation across generations represented values exceeding personal freedom, justifying whatever measures heritage defense demanded. Martha Ownby's continued occupation of 300-acre property in 2024 represented living testament to Lem's successful defense of ancestral land, property that remained undeveloped mountain terrain surrounded by resort construction and commercial development that surrounding areas had experienced during 55 years since rifle campaign, contrast demonstrating that violence, while condemned by legal systems, had achieved objective of protecting heritage from conspiracy that deed theft had facilitated. Martha's stewardship maintaining property through traditional practices, including small-scale farming and selective timber harvesting, preserved land character that 5 previous generations had established. Resistance to development pressures that offers from resort developers had repeatedly attempted purchasing property that Martha had consistently refused selling, explaining that Lem's sacrifice required maintaining family occupation regardless of financial incentives that commercial exploitation might provide. Contemporary property rights scholarship, examining ancestral land tenure, has used Ownby case as central example when analyzing conflicts between traditional occupation systems and modern development pressures. Researchers documenting patterns where elderly mountain landowners, whose properties developers viewed as valuable real estate, had experienced systematic attempts at acquisition through challenging titles, through purchasing properties during financial distress, through employing eminent domain for public projects that private development would ultimately benefit from. Studies revealed that Ownby's experience with development conspiracy represented broader phenomenon affecting Appalachian regions during 1960s-1970s, when tourism expansion and resort construction had created pressures on families whose ancestral claims modern legal frameworks inadequately protected against sophisticated acquisition schemes that corrupt federal agents' participation made. Particularly dangerous, Rebecca Ownby's advocacy work promoting property documentation protections had included developing educational materials, explaining Tennessee's complicated land grant history, and explaining why original deeds from territorial period were essential for defending against title challenges that modern surveys and recording systems couldn't adequately address without historical documentation proving. Unbroken chains of ownership. Educational programs that Rebecca had conducted for elderly landowners throughout Appalachian regions emphasized importance of preserving original documents, of obtaining certified copies for daily use while storing originals in secure locations, of understanding that deed theft during law enforcement operations represented calculated attacks requiring immediate legal responses rather than trusting that authorities would voluntarily return stolen documentation. Modern law enforcement training incorporating Ownby case had been implemented with mixed success. Department of Justice reports examining compliance with property documentation protocols during 2023-2024 period revealed that, while procedures requiring receipts and written consent had been established, implementation remained inconsistent when agents sometimes claimed exigent circumstances, justified removing original deeds for verification despite policies prohibiting such actions without owners' explicit authorization. Implementation challenges that property rights advocates pointed to as demonstrating that systemic reforms required not just procedures, but changing cultures that historically had prioritized enforcement objectives over protecting documentation, that populations whose traditional tenure systems depended on preserving irreplaceable records proving ownership spanning generations. Annual memorial services held at Ownby property brought together participants from both sides, examining how property theft and systematic violence had affected communities, gatherings that acknowledged complexity requiring honest examination of both legitimate grievances about development conspiracy and devastating violence that 11 deaths had created. Services typically included readings from Lem's written confession describing each killing with technical precision, demonstrating exceptional marksmanship, readings that created discomfort among some participants who maintained that celebrating shooting skills seemed inappropriate when discussing murders, but that others argued was necessary for understanding that Mountain Man's capabilities had made him formidable defender of heritage that corruption had underestimated. Most moving aspect of memorial services was presentation of recovered 1796 land grant deed that Martha would display, explaining that document represented not merely legal proof of ownership, but represented connection to ancestor who'd established property, and represented sacrifices that 5 generations had made maintaining continuous occupation, so that Lem's recovery of stolen deed through eliminating everyone involved in conspiracy had ensured that family could continue occupying land that modern development pressures had attempted acquiring through theft disguised as law enforcement. Deed's physical presence at memorials created tangible reminder that systematic violence, while condemned, had been motivated by protecting irreplaceable documentation that ancestral heritage depended on preserving. Jennifer Webb's participation in reconciliation efforts had been motivated by desire to understand grandfather's corruption and by recognition that Nashville Development Corporation's acquisition schemes had affected numerous families beyond Ownby. Research revealing that 17 properties conspiracy had obtained represented systematic fraud affecting entire region, whose traditional land tenure systems, modern legal frameworks had inadequately protected. Jennifer's conversations with Martha Ownby had explored questions about whether her grandfather deserved death for theft, that while criminal hadn't involved physical violence, discussions that acknowledged complexity when stolen documentation's significance exceeded what simple property crime suggested, and when conspiracy's systematic nature demonstrated calculated exploitation rather than isolated incident. Contemporary legal debates examining Ownby case focused on questions about appropriate penalties for property documentation theft during law enforcement operations. Discussions revealing tensions between those arguing that existing criminal statutes adequately addressed such theft and those maintaining that enhanced penalties were necessary for preventing corruption that institutional oversight had historically failed detecting. Property rights advocates emphasize that Lem Ownby Ancestral Property Protection Act, while establishing protocols, hadn't created sufficient criminal penalties for violations, that agents stealing deeds faced same charges as civilians, committing theft, despite betrayal of public trust, that law enforcement corruption represented creating need for enhanced punishment, reflecting additional harm that governmental authority abusing created. By 2024, the broader implications of Ownby case extended into discussions about appropriate responses to governmental corruption when institutional remedies prove inadequate. Debates examining whether systematic violence could ever be partially excused when legal systems failed protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation that corrupt agents facilitated. Legal scholars noted that while Ownby's convictions were appropriate under criminal law, case raised troubling questions about what remedies should exist when official channels refused prosecuting corruption and when documentation theft created immediate threats to property ownership that delayed legal responses couldn't adequately address. Institutional failures that, while not justifying violence, created conditions where desperate individuals might reasonably conclude that self-help was only available option for defending heritage. Modern property insurance industry had responded to Ownby case and similar incidents by developing specialized coverage for ancestral property documentation, policies that would reimburse costs of reconstructing title records when original deeds were lost or stolen, and that would provide legal defense coverage when title challenges arose from missing documentation. Insurance products that property rights advocates characterized as inadequate substitutes for preventing theft, but that represented practical responses to risks that Ownby case had highlighted when families whose original grants had been stolen faced expensive litigation defending ownership that proper documentation would have made unnecessary. The enduring legacy of Lem Ownby's rifle campaign manifest in multiple forms across Appalachian regions, from property documentation protocols that federal agencies had implemented to property rights movements invoking his name when advocating for stronger protections to cautionary tales that law enforcement training employed, demonstrating consequences when corruption creates grievances. Most powerful legacy remained Martha's continued occupation of ancestral property that Lem's violence had successfully defended. 300-acre mountain terrain that resort development had surrounded but hadn't acquired, representing tangible demonstration that systematic shooting, while legally condemned, had achieved objective, that motivated campaign when protecting heritage required employing whatever skills mountain living had taught and required, accepting imprisonment as necessary, sacrifice for ensuring family could maintain continuous occupation that ancestors had established. What Lem Ownby's systematic rifle campaign demonstrated most fundamentally about conflicts between traditional land tenure and modern development was that when ancestral property rights rooted in continuous occupation, spanning generations, collide with commercial pressures viewing valuable real estate through purely economic frameworks, when corrupt federal agents exploit enforcement authority for facilitating acquisition conspiracies, that elderly landowners' limited legal resources make them vulnerable to defending against, when institutional systems tolerate documentation theft through protecting agents whose successful statistics supervisors valued more than investigating corruption that development schemes required enabling. When legal remedies prove inadequate for timely recovery of stolen deeds or for prosecuting conspiracies, before title challenges can be filed, exploiting verification delays, then solitary mountain men possessing exceptional skills that wilderness living developed will employ systematic violence, defending heritage that ancestors established and that descendants are morally obligated. Maintaining even when protecting property requires accepting imprisonment as necessary. Sacrifice demonstrating that land ownership represents values exceeding personal freedom when alternatives mean losing everything to theft, that governmental authority facilitates rather than prevents. The complex moral questions that Lem Ownby's case continues raising about whether property documentation theft can ever justify systematic murder, about whether solitary individual defending ancestral heritage deserves different assessment than coordinated group violence, about whether corruption excuses violent responses when legal remedies exist, even if inadequate for timely relief, about whether exceptional circumstances of irreplaceable 1796 deed spanning 173 years creates distinctions from ordinary property crimes. These questions remain unresolved 55 years after Rifle Campaign because they require grappling with fundamental tensions between respecting rule of law and acknowledging that legal systems sometimes fail protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation that institutional failures enable, between condemning violence and recognizing that desperate circumstances can make self-help appear as only available option when official channels refuse delivering justice that corruption has made necessary. Modern commemoration of Lem Ownby through federal legislation bearing his name, through historical markers acknowledging complexity, through museum exhibits displaying recovered deed, through annual memorial services examining multiple perspectives, through continued family occupation of defended property. These various forms of remembrance demonstrate that even systematic violence that legal systems unequivocally condemned can achieve recognition when underlying grievances about corruption and when successful protection of heritage create narratives that simple condemnation inadequately captures. Property rights movement's invocation of Ownby as symbol, while simultaneously acknowledging that violence was unjustifiable, reflects broader cultural understanding that moral assessment requires examining contexts and motivations even when actions themselves deserve legal punishment. By 2024, 55 years after Precision Rifle Campaign that eliminated 11 people involved in development conspiracy, Lem Ownby remained controversial figure whose systematic shooting represented for some defenders righteous protection of ancestral land against corrupt governmental authority, while representing for others dangerous vigilante whose exceptional marksmanship enabled murders that legal remedies should have addressed despite inadequacy. This persistent disagreement about moral status reflected broader cultural conflicts about appropriate responses when institutions fail, about whether traditional land tenure deserves protections exceeding what modern frameworks provide, about whether corruption justifies violence, about whether defending heritage can ever partially excuse systematic murder. Fundamental questions that no amount of temporal distance or institutional reforms or reconciliation efforts will definitively resolve when competing values about property rights and rule of law and governmental accountability create tensions that honest examination must acknowledge rather than attempting to simplify. Through narratives that either celebrate resistance or condemn violence without recognizing complexity that Lem Ownby's Rifle Campaign embodied.